Why do us Stokies sound like this? We're going to take a brief tour through the history of North Staffordshire. North Staffordshire consists of the area around modern-day Stoke-on-Trent in England, famed at the turn of the 20th century for being the centre of the global ceramics industry. But how did we get there? In ancient times, the main tribe around here were the Cornovi, who spoke their own dialect of the common Brittonic language. The area at this time was mainly dominated by woodland and sparsely settled. Then came the Romans, doing Roman things like building roads, forts, towns, etc. in the region. The most important bit of infrastructure being Watling Street, which runs right through Staffordshire. There was certainly a Roman influence in North Staffordshire, with Chesterton being the main fort in the region, and evidence that the Romans took advantage of the local clay to make pottery. The Brittonic language at this time likely gained some Latin influence, and the Latin spoken by the occupying Romans also developed its own regional variation. So North Staffordshire has a long tradition of local distinct language. When the Romans left, the next significant migrations came from northern France and Germany in the form of the Anglo-Saxons. In North Staffordshire, the Angles were the dominant group, having settled from the northeast and working their way inland. Over the coming centuries, the language imported by the Angles came to be the norm in the region, developing into what would become Old English, or a local dialect of it. The Brittonic language more or less died out in the region at this point, and we start to see the first written literature in Old English. The next group to come to our shores were the Vikings in the 9th century, although their influence on Staffordshire was limited. North Staffordshire was part of the Kingdom of Mercia at this point, and the folk of Staffordshire likely spoke the kingdom's own distinct dialect of Old English. When the Danelaw came into being, and the kingdom was divided, Staffordshire ended up just to the west of the dividing line, so never went full Danish like Northumbria or Yorkshire, but it was on the cusp, so it likely saw some influence in local trading and the like. The next visitors to our shores were the Normans in 1066, and they certainly had an impact on North Staffordshire as they replaced the old nobility with Norman loyalists. At this time, the language of the court and legal system changed to French, although this shift didn't generally affect the local populace of North Staffordshire, who would have continued speaking their local dialect of evolving Old English. Jumping forward to the later medieval period now, we see the evolution of the language that we know as Middle English, the language of Chaucer, etc. It still largely had regional variations. The variation from North Staffordshire is captured in the story of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, written in the West Midlands dialect of Middle English, and is an important source for the language of this time. We're going to jump forward now, because the big shift came with the Industrial Revolution, when the region's population grew immensely in a relatively short period of time. The area's rich natural resources of clay, coal and iron came to power the rapid expansion of industry on a grand scale. This didn't happen overnight. North Staffordshire's pottery industry expanded in the 18th century as many innovations came, such as the arrival of the canals, but it truly took off in the 19th century as mass production became the norm. So what about the dialect at this point? Well, we do have a very interesting source for the dialect at this time, one I've used several times before on this channel. John Ward's 1843 book, The Borough of Stoke-on-Trent, etc., etc., which contains, amongst many other things, a faithful transcript of a conversation recorded in 1810 in the local dialect of the time, referred to as Old North Staff's dialect. Not quite the Potteries Dialect just yet. The two old-timers talking grew up in a time before mass production took off, so their conversation is a fascinating snapshot of the semi-rural, semi-urban dialect of the time. The fascinating part is just how much this dialect resembles the West Midland dialect of Middle English in several ways, despite the 400-year gap between them. The language, pronouns and grammar are all remarkably similar, and we can learn from this that the Proto-Potteries dialect remained quite faithful to the original regional dialect of Middle English, and by extension, the Mercian dialect of Old English. This was largely due to a phenomenon known in linguistics as a social greenhouse, with the region being fairly isolated and fairly sparsely populated in those 400 years before the Industrial Revolution. With the expansion of industry, we see a massive influx of industry-specific language added in the 19th century, coupled with the working conditions that naturally allowed such a dialect to flourish. Pottery workers often worked as families in the early 19th century and lived very close to their work, keeping interactions relatively local. Another example of this social greenhouse effect. Many features of the language, such as the dropping of H's, were probably introduced at this time. the noisy, echoey environments of the pot bank and the pit making them more or less redundant. New words such as franked came into use around this time, franked meaning the act of having your clocking card franked if you were late for work, something that wasn't really an issue until the capitalist age. Despite these innovations, many of the earlier features of Middle English remained. The use of pronouns such as they, thee, thy hark back to the Anglo-Saxon English, as does the use of the pronoun her for a woman rather than she. The Potteries dialect, then, was a mixture of Old English language preserved in isolation over a long period of time, with the addition of industry-specific slang and habits in the 19th century. I knew people born in the 1920s who still spoke this dialect as their first language, so we can probably pinpoint the zenith of the dialect at around the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when the bubbles of local industry were still very much in effect. So what happened? Why does nobody speak Broad Potteries dialect today? Well, I mentioned the zenith of the dialect was likely in the late 19th century, and the seeds were sown somewhat already for its decline, and the decline of other regional dialects too. Compulsory schooling for children came into force in the 1860s, breaking young children out of their local community bubble, and enforcing on them a form of English that was considered the proper way to speak. Their exposure to this was likely very limited until then, but being taught to read and write in standard English greatly expanded their exposure to it. Over time, the Potteries dialect became the form of speech used on the shop floor and down the pub, but increasingly not so much in other settings such as in church. In short, there gradually became somewhat of a stigma attached to it. This stigma was certainly evident in my grandma's generation, where it was often considered the language of the working class, who were more than proud to own it and wear it with pride, but it was often shunned by the more educated, emerging middle class who stuck to proper English as a matter of propriety and professionalism. Another thing that set it on the road to decline was the gradual erosion of the language greenhouse effect over time. It wasn't so much that the bubble burst overnight, but it gradually became more porous as the region was exposed to more outside influence. By the later 19th century, Stoke-on-Trent and wider North Staffordshire was widely connected by rail to the rest of the UK, and in the early 20th century we saw an increase in migration of industry-specific workers, particularly in the coal mines from other areas of the UK during the war years. Many Welsh, Yorkshire and Geordie miners came to North Staffordshire in that time, bringing with them their own accents and dialects, and perhaps introducing the need for a more consistent language between them. In the 20th century came the introduction of radio and later the television, which as a matter of principle primarily featured speakers of formal, received pronunciation English. It became more widely accepted that this was the correct way to speak, particularly amongst the youth who were perhaps the most enthusiastic consumers of this new form of entertainment. So by the mid-20th century, many working-class children, now widely literate, were essentially bilingual, with their use of Potteries dialect at home and on the playground, and standard English at school and from the media. So though many still lived in their close-knit, mainly terraced house communities close to their school and to their work, there were more and more external influences on them in this time. The post-war period is perhaps where we can start to see the major decline. The war hit many smaller pottery firms hard, and the number of smaller manufacturers began to shrink as their assets were bought up by larger firms such as Staff's Pots. Increasingly people were working in larger workforces. The post-war period also saw a considerable shift in living conditions, as more and more slums were cleared, and people moved into more spacious, purpose-built modern housing estates. This allowed people of different backgrounds to mix socially, probably for the first time, as there were no initial barriers to social housing. Teachers and bank clerks now lived on the same street as potters and colliers, and in similar conditions. The out-of-town location of these housing estates also necessitated the need for travel to work, or perhaps a change in working location altogether. This was made even easier by the local Potteries Loop Line railway, the trams, and increasingly modern roads with buses. In the later 20th century, more and more people began to own cars, further expanding the horizons in terms of where people could work, and allowing travel to other parts of the country with ease on the new motorways. So we gradually see the erosion of this bubble, or social greenhouse, over time. We also can't discuss the decline of the Potteries dialect without discussing the decline of the industries that helped to propagate it. The coal industry declined from the early 1960s onwards, and increased rapidly in the 1980s and 90s to the point where the last colliery in the city closed in 1998. This dispersed thousands of mining jobs to the wider workforce in that time, and shattered entire close-knit communities, with more and more people moving away. As for the pottery industry, this wasn't so much the victim of a targeted government closure programme, but fell victim to the growing trend of globalisation, allowing manufacturing jobs to be outsourced for cheaper labour elsewhere. Between 1975 and 2000, some 30,000 jobs in the pottery industry disappeared from Stoke-on-Trent. Of course, with the decline of the pottery industry came the decline of the industry-specific slang that grew up around it, resigning it to the status of being a bit of a nostalgia act for those who remember it. No comment. Today, Stoke-on-Trent is still a city in flux. It hasn't really moved on completely from its industrial past, and nor does it seem to have a consistent plan for the future. As a result, the city currently has an economy based around low-paid, high-turnover sectors such as distribution or services such as call centres. The high turnover means an influx and outflux of workers from all over, with the city having a considerably more diverse population these days, with many migrant workers from Europe, permanent residents of different ethnic backgrounds and social backgrounds, and also an influx of university students for the Kiel and Staffshire unis. So the Potteries are certainly not an isolated region anymore. Also, needless to say, the youth of today are also exposed to a plethora of media from all over the world, making regional dialects such as the Potteries Dialect largely a thing of the past, in favour of wider social trends. Stoke-on-Trent isn't a grain ice anymore, and it hasn't been for a long time, though it was disassembled bit by bit rather than completely smashed in. There are those, of course, who seek to preserve this dialect. I mentioned a number of these sources in this other video on this channel, and of course this channel itself is doing its bit to try and preserve the Potteries dialect, whether that be as a nostalgic novelty or an important bit of social history. I guess that's for you, the viewers, to decide. Hope you've enjoyed this little trip through the history of North Staffordshire, and why we speak the way we do, or did. Ta very much for watching, and I'll say thee again next time.